Most of us can't remember the last time we lowered ourselves all the way to the ground and just stayed there. Not perched on the edge of a chair, not crouched for a second to pick something up, but settled fully into a deep squat, heels down, hips low, in no hurry to stand back up. It used to be an unremarkable part of daily life. People cooked over low fires from this position, tended gardens, waited for buses, talked with neighbors, all without a chair anywhere nearby. Then furniture, plumbing, and desk-based work quietly rewired how humans rest their bodies. And within a couple of generations, the deep squat all but disappeared from ordinary life across much of the world. Nobody outlawed it or forgot it through some dramatic event. It was engineered out by convenience. One chair and one toilet seat at a time. And because it left so quietly, almost nobody noticed what else might have gone with it. Somewhere underneath that shift is a part of your physiology that gets almost no attention until something goes wrong with it. The lymphatic system. Unlike your circulatory system, which has a heart to push blood along, your lymphatic vessels have no central pump of their own. Lymph fluid moves because your muscles contract around it, because you breathe, because you walk, bend, twist, and change position throughout the day. It's a passive system in the sense that it depends entirely on you doing the work. When you move less, or move through a narrower range of positions, flow slows, in whatever regions are seeing the least mechanical activity. For a lot of modern adults, that region is the lower body, and specifically the pelvic basin, since sitting for long stretches keeps the hips, groin, and pelvic floor locked into one shallow, unchanging position for most of the waking day. It's worth being honest about how much of this is settled physiology and how much is a newer way of framing the body that's still being worked out. The idea that lymphatic vessels are mechanosensitive, that they respond to physical pressure and stretch rather than to any pump of their own, is genuinely well documented. What's far less settled is exactly how much a specific practice like a deep squat changes lymphatic flow in the pelvis, and how directly that connects to the sweeping list of benefits sometimes attached to it, from hormone balance to slower cellular aging. Some of that chain is real physiology. Some of it is a plausible-sounding story stacked on top of real anatomy. The honest version of this practice sits somewhere in between. A simple low-risk movement with a reasonable mechanistic case behind it, not a miracle fix for everything that changes in your body after 40. Still, it's not hard to see why the idea resonates. Ask most people what happens to their body after 40 and you'll get some version of the same list. Joints that complain more, a metabolism that seems to slow down, energy that isn't what it used to be, a mental fog that used to lift in minutes and now lingers for hours. It's tempting and convenient to file all of that under aging and leave it there. But a fair amount of what gets blamed on age alone is really the accumulated effect of decades spent in a narrower and narrower range of motion. Bodies adapt to what you ask of them. Ask a joint to bend fully every day and it stays capable of bending fully. Ask it to sit at 90 degrees for 8 hours and eventually it gets very good at exactly that and not much else. It's also true that a number of regions studied for unusually long, healthy lifespans. Parts of Okinawa and Sardinia. Among them, Tento Ave, populations who spend more of their lives sitting on the floor, squatting to garden or cook, and generally moving through a fuller range of hip and ankle motion than people in most industrialized cities. It would be a stretch to claim researchers have isolated squatting itself as a driver of that longevity. These populations also differ in diet, social connection, activity levels overall, and plenty of other variables that are much harder to separate out than a single joint position. But it's a reasonable, modest observation rather than a wild one. People who never stopped moving through their full range of motion also tend to be people who keep that range of motion late into life. And losing mobility is itself linked to a cascade of other problems, from reduced activity to worse balance, to more sedentary time overall. The squat isn't a documented secret ingredient in anyone's longevity. It's more like one visible marker of a body that never got the memo to stop moving fully. The pelvic basin is a particularly dense piece of that infrastructure. Below the navel sits a network of lymph nodes and vessels, including the inguinal nodes near the groin and the deeper iliac chain that helps clear waste and immune signals from the lower digestive tract, the reproductive organs, the bladder, and the muscles and connective tissue of the pelvic floor. This isn't some obscure corner of anatomy. It's a genuinely busy drainage route. When it's working well, immune cells move efficiently through it, and metabolic byproducts get swept along with everything else. when flow through this region is chronically reduced, whether from long-term sitting, limited circulation, or simply a lack of varied movement. Waste and inflammatory signals have fewer chances to clear, and there's a reasonable body of research suggesting that kind of low-grade, unresolved inflammation plays a role in how tissues age over time. That broad connection is fairly well accepted. Exactly how much any single daily habit contributes to it is much harder to measure. This is where the deep squat, sometimes called Malisana in yoga traditions, earns its reputation as something more than an ordinary stretch. At full depth, several things happen at once. The hip flexors and inner thigh muscles lengthen under load. The pelvic floor is asked to stretch and support weight at the same time, and pressure inside the abdomen rises as the pelvis drops closer to the floor. That combination of sustained stretch and load is exactly the kind of mechanical input that lymphatic vessels are built to notice. The cells lining these small vessels respond to physical force through a process called mechanotransduction, converting pressure and shear stress into biological signals that can influence how readily fluid moves through them. Ordinary daily movement rarely reproduces this particular mix of depth, duration, and sustained pressure through the groin and inner thighs, which is a large part of why a full squat feels different from a light stretch, and why people who teach this position argue it does something a partial range of motion simply doesn't. If you want to try it, the setup matters more than people expect. Stand with your feet a little wider than hip width, and let your toes turn out slightly, just enough to open the front of the pelvis without forcing anything. Lower yourself slowly, letting your knees track out over your toes and your hips settle down and back, rather than dropping straight down. Try to keep your heels flat on the floor. If leave a folded towel or a thin book under each heel is a completely reasonable modification, while your ankles adjust and there's no need to feel rushed out of using one. Once you're settled near the bottom, bring your palms together at your chest and use your elbows to press gently outward against your inner thighs, which deepens the opening through the groin without forcing your knees wider than they want to go. From there, lengthen your spine upward rather than letting your back round completely, so the pelvis is dropping while the torso stays relatively tall. If you have knee, hip, or lower back issues, it's genuinely worth checking with a physical therapist or doctor before working toward a deep, sustained hold, since this position isn't equally suited to every body or every joint history. How long you hold it matters less than doing it consistently, but many teachers of this pose suggest working toward somewhere around 90 seconds as a rough target. Not because there's a precise clinical cutoff proven in a lab, but because it tends to take roughly that long for the initial tightness through the hips and groin to soften and for the body to actually settle into the position instead of just passing through it. If 90 seconds feels far off right now, even 20 or 30 seconds held with decent form, done consistently, is a completely reasonable place to start. No equipment, no elaborate program. Just a few minutes a day spent in a position your body was, at some point in its history, entirely used to holding far longer than that. In the first week or two, most people notice discomfort before they notice anything else. A real pulling sensation through the inner thighs and groin, and sometimes an unfamiliar tightness through the pelvic floor itself. That's ordinary tissue adapting to load it hasn't seen in a long time. Not a sign that something's wrong, though. Sharp pain or anything felt directly in a joint is a signal to ease off rather than push through. Past that initial adjustment, a lot of people who stick with it describe a subjective sense of looser hips, less tension carried through the lower back and groin, and occasionally an easier time with digestion. It's worth staying a little skeptical about how much of that improvement to credit to the squat specifically versus the general benefit of simply moving more and sitting less throughout the day. Either way, looser hips and less carried tension are genuinely useful outcomes on their own, without needing to lean on bigger, harder to verify claims about hormones or cellular aging to make the practice worthwhile. None of this requires abandoning modern medicine or treating a daily squat as a substitute for a doctor who actually knows your history and your labs. What it offers is a low-cost, low-risk way to ask your body to move through a range it may not have visited in years, and a reminder that some of what gets filed away as inevitable decline is really just disuse, wearing a more official-sounding name. If it's been years, or you genuinely can't remember, since you last sat all the way down to the floor without a chair underneath you, that's worth noticing, not because it makes you broken, but because it's one of the more easily fixable gaps in an otherwise very full life. A few minutes on the floor today costs you almost nothing to find out what's still there.